My name is Christina Strassfield, and I'm the Museum Director and Chief Curator, and I'm so delighted that you're all here this afternoon. We are so delighted to welcome Joan Marter, our guest curator for this exhibition. But before I talk about all of Joan's glorious accolades, I just have a few little announcements. I wanted to thank our lead sponsor, Lucio and Joan Noto, who is Joan is, I believe Lou is here. Thank you so much, we so appreciate it. We'd also like to thank the Betty Parsons Foundation, who helped us underwrite the cost of our catalog, which is available for sale in the gift shop. Plug, plug, plug. And Joan will be here. It's the perfect hostess gift for you to take for the holidays. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Barbara Gibbs and the Robert Lehman Foundation. And I want to acknowledge the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation and the Jerry Foundation for the support of the digitization of this project. A special shout out to Jess Frost, the Associate Curator of the Permanent Collection, who oversaw the digitization project. I encourage you all to take a look at the website and the 2,428 works of art in our permanent collection. Wow. Jess really deserves an applause because it's an amazing. I also want to thank Casey Dibley, the Associate Curator and Associate Curatorial Assistant, and she's also the curator of the exhibition behind this. Casey does an amazing job putting everything together that we need to put an exhibition together. So thank you so much. I also want to thank Joe Brando, our marketing executive here. I also want to thank Anthony Madonna, I saw, and are there any other staff? I think those are the only staff that are here presently. Very good, thank you so much. We also extremely want to thank some of the lenders, because the majority of this exhibition is from our permanent collection, but we do have some wonderful loans to help supplement what we don't have in our collection. So I want to thank Rick Friedman and Cindy Lou Wakefield for letting the amazing palettes that we have here. Thank you so much. I want to thank Audrey Flack, who's lent us an amazing piece, her gallery, which is right across the way, and we look forward to hearing maybe a little bit from Audrey at that point when we get there, and the two pieces from the Betty Parsons Foundation, and John Ullman, who has lent us the David Slivka piece. So thank you so much for all of this. So I just want to say that Joan Marter is a distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University. She has taught for 38 years in the Department of Art History and was director of the Curatorial Studies program. Since 2006, she has been editor-in-chief of the Women's Art Journal, an international publication on women in artists. Dr. Marter has organized 20 exhibitions, including Women of Abstract Expressionism, which came to Guildhall in 1999, following an installation at the City University of New York. She was the co-organizer of Women of Abstract Expressionism at the Denver Art Museum in 2016, which traveled to Palm Springs and other venues. She has a list of her books, essays, and exhibition catalogs, and just published a book on women artists of Rutgers, including Alice Aycock, who is here as well. Alice? Wonderful. And Joan Snyder, among others. So thank you so much, Joan, for all that you did for this wonderful exhibition, and it was truly a pleasure. We've all so enjoyed the process of working with you.
Thank you. And I want to thank Christina and Jess and Casey, who were absolutely a pleasure to work with. And especially Casey and Jess, especially Jess for her great project, the digital collection that you can find online, and it was a big help to me. And I have to say, I think I started coming to the Guildhall in 1977, and I had no idea that they had so many things in their collection. Wonderful things, and it's only grown over the years, but it is wonderful now. And I have been still using it because I'm always checking to see if I missed something, and I also want to see what you have of certain artists that I know. So it is a great, great resource for everyone, and I'm very thrilled to see it, to have it online, and to have, of course, the images that go with it. Now, the plan is, I guess, are they there yet, these pages?
Yes, they are.
Oh, good. So if you are interested in getting all of the details of the works, and you don't want to look too closely at the labels, or it's hard to get near them, there is this list that is sort of organized by location in the space, so that it starts actually at that corner and it goes around the room. So, and then of course into the Woodhouse Gallery as well. So it's very helpful. And then, as we said, there's an exhibition catalog which you can purchase in the museum shop. Okay, so this is a show that celebrates the abstract expressionists, and I'd say it celebrates them in several ways, because many of you are probably already aware of the fact that this is a movement that was first on the international scene. That is to say, this country, as an art entity, as a cultural phenomenon, received recognition for the abstract expressionists as a great development, and it was recognized internationally, as well as these artists being collected internationally. But it's more important to us here because, as somebody just said to me, it all happened here. It did. It all happened here. The artists that you see in this exhibition all have something to do with Hamptons. They all, in many instances, not only knew one another, but were friends with one another, went to the beach together, spent evenings together, had meals together. And we know that. We know what happened. We know what happened. We know that they saw one another in New York. There was something called the Club. That was an opportunity for artists to get together and discuss, have actually panel discussions about art. They also went to the Cedar Bar, but they came here too. And I think one of the things that's so important about the work that you see here is that it is a balance between the ideas about abstraction, which I'll go into a little bit, and the experience of being here in the Hamptons, which is to say, in nature. All right, so how did this all happen? The term abstract expressionism goes back to the early 20th century, and it was first used for Kandinsky. And then in the 40s, Robert Coates came along, and he called Hans Hofmann an abstract expressionist. So that was the first use of this term. Now, I don't think all of the artists really liked the term. They didn't like it when they were called abstract expressionists necessarily. But what it really said is that the work was abstract, but it's also subjective, which is what expressionism means. Expressionism speaks to the subjectivity of these artists. All right, so abstract and expressionism. Now, what were some of the issues? And we can think about this as a post-World War II art. And we know some of the things that were happening at the end of World War II. The beginnings of the Cold War, the atom bomb being dropped. There were lots of things that were happening internationally at that time. Things that caused both, sort of relief because it was the end of the war, but also, we might say, anxiety. And that's reflected in some of this art as well. It's a balance between that kind of expressionism and this awareness that these people had, these artists had, about their surroundings in the Hamptons, in the East End of Long Island, and the beauty of it. And that was, I think, something that we see expressed in the work, and in some cases even in the titles. The work tells us so much about who these artists were. They had an interest in abstraction, which came to them in the post-war period, partially out of the awareness they had of the Surrealists. And you probably know that a number of the Surrealists came here, escaping the war, during the war years, actually in the 40s. They came here and stayed here, like Max Ernst was here for a while with Brad Olam, Andre Breton, Duchamp. And these artists brought certain ideas about the unconscious, about free association, and also about making an art where there were no preliminary sketches, there were no preliminary ideas, the idea of working directly on the canvas, just starting out and working. And we know that's the way Pollock worked, for example. So the Surrealists, some of them went back, some of them were no longer here, but their ideas stayed with the artists who came here. Now, the other important thing, I wanted to start here because these paintings by Lee Krasner are behind me. Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, who you see on the other end of the room, were really among the first to settle here. They came here in 45, they bought a house, and many of the artists came out here first to visit them, to stay with them in some cases, and then to find a property for themselves or to rent a property. So they were sort of the vanguard of people coming out here to stay. And Lee, as you probably know, worked in a back room, bedroom, while Pollock had the studio being a barn that they moved to take it away from their view of Acabana Creek. But they moved the studio back, the barn back, and that was what he used. But Lee used an upstairs bedroom, and she worked therefore in a very small space. Now the painting of hers that is an absolute knockout, that belongs to Guildhall, it's called Shattering Color, you'll find it in the catalog, is 22 by 25. Think about that. That's not just about 2 feet in either direction. And that's the painting that she made. It's a little image painting that she made in the 1950s. However, the painting that you see behind me is Lee Krasner in the 1960s. This is when she was working in the studio. She had the studio to herself at this point because Pollock passed away in 1956, and this painting is from the 1960s. It still has some of the qualities of the little image paintings, but I think in this case, enlarged to a larger scale. And then as you can see, there are some interesting prints by Lee on either side that give you an idea of her work. Shattering Color that I mentioned earlier is traveling with a very important show of Lee's work that started out in London and now has gone on to Germany and eventually will go to Spain. And it has a huge catalog that goes with it, and it is giving her international recognition, which she so greatly deserves at this point in her life. Now, this collection then has been formed over years, but the artists that are shown in this collection all represent artists who were working here. It doesn't mean that they were here full-time necessarily, but they were here, they had studios here, they knew the other artists. I'm looking over on the side here at the work of James Brooks, which is a really wonderful painting by him. And it also speaks to the idea of the accidental, because we know that because of the materials he was using in his painting, he discovered that there was a kind of shadow cast by some of the colors that he was applying. And those shadows became the shapes that he introduced into his painting. And he actually developed the idea from what started out actually as an accident. James Brooks was here with his wife, who we see on the opposite side of the room, Charlotte Park. We see 2 works on paper by her. And again, you can see that this is an artist who is responding to the landscape out here. In both cases, you can see, for example, in even the titles that some of the artists choose, that they are creating something that is not a non-objective work, in fact. It's not just geometric abstraction. It is, in fact, based on forms and nature and their experience of nature. We have on the right here an artist who is very important, sometimes forgotten as an artist, and that's Betty Parsons. Betty Parsons was extremely important to these artists because she had a gallery. She lived on the North Fork, she had a home there, but she was working as an artist from the 1930s. She even had a show in Paris early on. But she was out here working on her art, also responding to the art that was being produced by other artists around her, but also showing their work in New York. And so she showed Pollock's work, among others, and she showed also a number of women artists. I think she was especially important for promoting the work of women artists. And then on this side, again, you see a painting by Alfonso of Soria, a very interesting early work by him with a fabulous frame, as you can see. And Osorio was important to the Hamptons, not just as an artist, very importantly as an artist, but also because he had cottages on his property, and he invited artists to come and stay. So many artists who wanted to be introduced to the Hamptons would come and stay with Osorio. And he was a lifelong friend of Pollock, Krasner, and many of the artists that were out here. And in fact, I should mention in this respect that at one point in the 60s, there was a gallery out here, right on Main Street, called the Signa Gallery. And this was supported by a number of artists, one of them being John Little, who's also in this exhibition, and then Elizabeth Parker, whose work is in the other gallery. And many of the artists showed their work there, as well as having meetings and discussions about art in this gallery. It existed for a few years, in fact, and previously you had a show of Signa Gallery, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move. I want to go down to the Pearl Fine work that you see in the far corner of the room. Want to take a chair? Okay. Okay. Yes. I can't help but mention a few of the artists, in particular, who were friends of mine, who I knew for a long period of time, and one of them was David Slifka. And this is a work of David Slifka's. It's a later work, but David was working in a style very much like this. He said he was inspired by the trees that he saw in the woods in East Hampton, and he liked working with wood and painting it. And I wanted to say something a little bit more about abstract expressionism, and that is there's this idea of an all-over effect. That's part of the abstraction. And you see that in so many of these pieces. You don't see very much that there is a kind of negative and positive space, the way there is typically in a painting, where there's an object and then the surrounding space. More typical is this kind of all-over effect. And there's an interest in gesture, there's an interest in brushwork that is very prominent, and there's a feeling of experimentation. And that is especially true, I think, of some of the sculptors. So in the case of this, really, I would say there's not too much that looks exactly like this, if anything. I mean, it's a very unusual piece. The painted shapes, the way in which it occupies three-dimensional space, and it's called Galaxy. And like his friend, Ibram Lassaw, who we will see in the next room, there was implications, we might say, of the cosmos, which was another aspect of the world around us that these artists admired. I wanted to give special attention to Pearl Fine. I didn't know her personally, but I've always greatly admired her work. And she was chosen for both of the exhibitions that I organized that were based on the theme of women in abstract expressionism. She was in the show at the Denver Art Museum in 2016, but the show that I did here, that came here from the City University Gallery in New York, also included Pearl Fine. And she is a wonderful artist. She started out as a student of Hans Hofmann, which many of these artists were. Lee Krasner certainly was as well, and many of the others. And this is the work, this is one of a number of works that they have in the collection at Guildhall. But Pearl Fine was always very indebted to Mondrian, who she knew. And at one point she actually made a reconstruction of a Mondrian painting for a collection because the painting was damaged over time. So when she did this kind of work for a while, and then she actually returned to something that was much more almost like minimal art, you know, geometric forms. And examples of that work are also in the collection. So as you might imagine, when we were looking through everything that was available for the show, we made a selection of the things that seemed most appropriate. And that makes me think that there's something else I need to say to you, since obviously I don't have anything written down, so these things are just occurring to me as I think about them. I wanted to mention the fact that I called this show Abstract Expressionism Revisited. And it's revisited in several respects. It's revisited because many of us, including me, didn't know that all these paintings were owned by the Guildhall Museum. But it's also revisited because it seems to have lasted longer than we might have thought. In other words, we think of, you know, like, since I teach art history, we tend to put ourselves in these boxes. Like, okay, so abstract expressionism, that's the 40s and 50s. And then you get minimalism. Then you get, you know, things like the women's movement and things like that. Everything has a decade. Well, guess what? Some of the artists in this show, and I'll pick out de Kooning, and Elaine de Kooning and Bill de Kooning as examples, and some of the others like Slivka, they get involved with this approach to art and they stay with it. That's true of Lee Krasner also. They stay with it. They want to keep developing their ideas in abstraction, and ultimately the work relates to abstract expressionism. So you might walk around the show and say, oh, this is odd because this work is from 1980. This one, for example, was later. Why is this in the show? That's not abstract expressionism. That's, you know, that's something, but it's, you know, it's much later. Well, guess what? It can be revisited over time. Abstract expressionism exists for these artists, and it is their approach. It is their signature as artists. I will talk a little bit more when we get into the next gallery and look at the work of Ibram Lassaw about the idea of an artist who is a sculptor becoming an abstract expressionist. And Ibram always told me that he was an abstract expressionist. You know, I'm an abstract expressionist. And he thought he was because he had no preliminary studies, and he would fire up his equipment and he would start dripping metal on surfaces, and he worked in a way that was, in his mind, part of the same kind of expressionism as the painters. In other words, there was a freedom of expression. The this work by Pearl Fine then is, I think, definitely based on nature. And you can see the Pollocks on the other side of the room there. And I will put in my standard plea for, and I've been doing this for a number of people that have called to ask about the exhibition, and my recommendation that it would be nice for someone, or more than one person, to give a major Pollock or even a Pollock painting to this collection, because as you can see, there is one drawing that is owned by the Guildhall Museum, and that's the one that you see in the center there on Hal paper. And then there's a print that's on the opposite wall, and the other works that you see, the wonderful drawings that you see, were lent by Rick Friedman and Cindy Lou Wakefield, who are standing right there, and they're wonderful works, and we're happy to have them. However, we would like to have a big Pollock in the collection, something as large as Pearl Fine, or yes, I mean that, you know, and one of, you know, going back to the purpose of this exhibition is it is selections from the collection. If the person who gave that work, or persons, was aware of the fact and accepting of the fact that these works would be regularly shown in Guildhall, in this beautiful space with this wonderful lighting, they might be more inclined to honor the museum with the gift of a work by Jackson Pollock. So there are many things that the museum could have But I mean, that is a great need. And Pollock, why am I saying Pollock? Pollock is identified with this area. Pollock is so important. I mentioned how they came out here early and everybody else kind of followed them. But Pollock is at the center of abstract expressionism. And so he's really important to be shown here. I was the other day at the Museum of Modern Art, and there was the Pollock room, and opposite Pollock and on every wall, there was a Lee Krasner, a huge one, as a matter of fact. I was very delighted for her sake that she received that kind of recognition. So before we go to the other side, does anybody have any questions or anything that you want to comment on? Yeah.
I have a quick question. Are all of the artists represented in this room first generation abstract expressionists?
That is a very important question, okay? Because the art historians and critics have, sort of cursed us, I think, with this notion of first generation, second generation.
Right.
And Irving, my friend, recently departed, and I have had discussions about this, and his idea is the first generation are the ones that first came up with the ideas, and the other people were either later chronologically, or they were later because they were not the initiators. And I have always disputed that because, of course, Lee was actually older than her husband, Jackson Pollock, right?
4 years. Right.
By 4 years. And what? Today's her birthday? Happy birthday, Lee. That's nice. I'm glad to hear that. But how could we call her second generation? No. Is Pearl Fine second generation? She was on the jury of the 9th Street show. This brings up another bugaboo of mine. Mary Gabriel's book called 9th Street Women, which is all over the place now. She doesn't even include Pearl Fine. She has all of these women that were in the 9th Street show. Not all, but a group of women, especially the more young and attractive ones like Helen Frankenthal. But she doesn't include Pearl Fine, who was on the jury. And was in every show after that, all of those stable gallery shows. So this business of first and second generation no longer makes any sense. And I've written over the years about how long it took the women to get recognized as abstract expressionists. In fact, even when I did the show in 1997, I was afraid to call it Women Abstract Expressionists. So I called it Women and Abstract Expressionism, because I thought somebody's going to hit me with this, And they did. I mean, it was Hilton Kramer, but anyway. But the fact is, now I think we accept the fact that women are abstract expressionists, and they're in the first generation. I mean, you could set it up chronologically, but I think that even that's kind of ridiculous, because I think that it's not about who was the first one to drip painting on the ground or something like that. It's really not right. Okay, there she is. Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes, Rick.
Were most of the artists during the late 40s and 50s painting in this genre, and how does Barefoot Water fit in?
That's a good question too, because as a matter of fact, people were not all painting like this. All right? I mean, there were realist painters that were around in this time. There were people who were still interested in the figure, some more realistic than others. I can think of, Milton Avery and other people who are famous American artists who you would not call abstract expressionists. Now, the interesting thing there, I'll just mention this, in the late 50s, in 59, America suddenly came up with the idea that they should do some propaganda about the fact that we have such a free and open society that we would allow people to do paintings like this and not be like the Soviets who made everybody do realist art. So they did an international exhibition that traveled all over Western Europe, and it was called the New American Painting. And the only woman of this group who was included in the exhibition, there was only one woman, and that was Grace Hartigan, we'll see in the next room. She was included. None of these other women were included, but Pollock was there, and many of the other abstract expressionists were there. And we wanted to show that off because it showed our society was open. It was accepting of different types of expression for art. And there's no question it was meant as propaganda for our society, because we were concerned about, especially certain European countries having an influence from Eastern Europe and specifically from the Soviets. Okay, any other comments? Yes.
What was happening in the 50s with these local museums? Why weren't they purchasing these art from the artists at the time when they were painting?
Yeah, well, this museum opened in 1931, and when it opened, it had mostly artists, earlier artists, and I have a feeling, for this museum and many others, there is an acquisition problem, which is to say there is not very much of a budget for acquisitions. So yes, they should have bought things, but it wasn't possible for them to buy. I mean, it would be certainly true even now. Let's say, for example, if we asked them to buy contemporary art now, it would be the same thing. Acquisitions are a problem for museums. I taught at a university, and we had a museum, and most of our collection is based on gifts. There's very little in terms of an acquisition budget. Yeah.
But in Pollock's day, when he was alive,
Yeah.
was this
What?
museum amenable to his work? Or did
Absolutely. You can take a look in the catalog and you'll see that there was Christina can tell you too, right?
He actually offered work to Guildhall, and at that time, we did not have a place to store it. So it would be stored, believe it or not, it would be stored in the attic, so we declined to get it.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Because they did show the artists, when he had Life magazine, he
Yeah.
actually showed it at that time. So they were that's what the director was very much aware, and was showing the of the.
Okay, we're gonna move it to the other side. Okay, we're gonna go and look at the fabulous painting of Audrey Flack. Fortunately for me, I knew that Audrey Flack had an apex period before she did her wonderful realist paintings, which you can see at the Parish Art Museum. And we are also here, by the way, they have a very nice collection of Audrey Flack's later work here. But I wanted one, because I knew about them, I wanted one from the 1950s. So, here it is. And we have to congratulate her, because this is, I think, if not the star of this room, the main star of the show. And then we can hear that she did this when she was 20 years old. She was 20 years old. There's Audrey. You want to say something about it?
So long ago, she doesn't recognize me.
Yeah, there's a hole,
Oh, dear.
and I'll tell you about the hole.
Okay.
You see it?
Audrey, we need that for the documentation.
You didn't do it.
I'm going to be at Hollis Taggart next week. I'll tell them.
No, he knows about the hole.
Okay.
So I was at Yale with Albert, who was in great trouble because he had just left Black Mountain and was the dean of Yale, and he inherited students that didn't know what he was talking about. They were more academic students, and he was German Bauhaus, very strict.
Yes, yeah.
And he was about to lose his job. So we went to Cooper Union, and he said, who's your most avant-garde rebel? They said, so he was very smart, because he knew that he couldn't shake up the students because they didn't understand him. But if he had students painting amongst them, because they were painting, we make fun of them now, which I don't. They were painting with very thin brushes with 4 hairs. They were doing gold leaf. They were really trained academically. So the hall is there because I had a studio and a big room, and I took a place where I could step back 20 feet because I had been hanging around with Pollock and I wanted to go beyond Pollock. So what I did is I had cans of paint. I would mix paint, I'd stand here and I'd go, and the brush went through the canvas.
That's
So
funny.
you can see it.
Wow, okay, as long as we can
Story of the
document
brush,
it,
but
thank you.
we
Wow.
revolutionized this tool.
Well, and you're in good company here. You have Elaine de Kooning alongside us here. And on the other wall, Grace Hartigan. Now, I wanted to point out that it's perfect that these works are next to one another because I mentioned Grace was the only one in this show called The New American Painting. And she went through a complete abstract period where there was no recognizable imagery in her work. But, you know, some references to nature or whatever. But then she returned to figuration, so to speak. This painting is a little later, but part of the influence on her, undoubtedly, was de Kooning, who we see farther along there on the wall. And you probably all know the fact that as much as we talk about abstract expressionism, de Kooning only briefly was truly in making paintings that were fully abstract, the way this one is, of Audrey's. He always was interested in the figure, especially the female figure, and there are definitely figurative references in these works, as there are, of course, in Elaine de Kooning's works, which are a little later. And that was also true of the Grace Hartigan that you see on the other wall. And even though this is a somewhat later work, she was working in the 1950s using figurative elements in her work. Now, while I'm sitting here, I also wanted to mention the Ibram lasso, and I'm wearing one of Ibram's works because he also did jewelry. And when he would make something like that, his whole idea was that he didn't have a sketch, he didn't have a predetermination. It came about as he worked. And I remember when my daughter was very young, we went to Ibram's studio and he fired up the equipment, his oxyacetylene torch and everything. Do you remember that? And he dripped metal and he actually made you a little thing. And that's the way these works were made, and they're truly exceptional. And that also has, I think, a link to cosmic forms, or the idea of the cosmos, and that was a special interest of his. But I think it's interesting that there is a way in which artists who were working in 3 dimensions, primarily, as Ibram was, still found a way to respond to the idea of improvisation and the kind of spontaneity that we associate with abstract expressionism, but also experimentation. And those are 2 other words that I think I should mention: experimentation and individuality. So Ibram very proudly declared himself an abstract expressionist, and his neighbors were Pollock and de Kooning. As all of you that lived in the Springs know, he was right among them all the time. And I once said to Ibram, well, Ibram, it's so wonderful you're here and a lot of the other people are no longer here. And he said, yes, but you have to realize I didn't drink the way they do. I mean, that's what he told me, so that was true. A great person. So also in this room, and it's a wonderful room, we have a sculpture by Adolph Gottlieb, which is somewhat unusual. I have to say, when I saw this, I was immediately enamored of it because it reminds me of Pollock, which was the subject of my dissertation. But it has these, painted aluminum forms that kind of are Calder-like, with this interesting base. And then on the other side of the room, a wonderful painting by John Little, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the founding members of the Signa Gallery, and who lived very close to Pollock at Duck Creek Farm. And after he came out here, he decided that he wanted to be out here too, and joined the others. The work that is on the far wall there in red is another Gottlieb, and that's very typical of his. He has a series of works. These have been variously interpreted. They're often called the Burst series. And I think, many people have seen this as having, some response to some sort of nuclear holocaust or some sort of change in the world. If you can see the thing below as a kind of chaotic form. That's one interpretation that has been given to the Burst series. There's a work by Motherwell. Motherwell, of course, had a wonderful exhibition here in recent years, so we have one Motherwell there on the opposite wall, and also a work by Conrad Macchiarelli, who was one of the neighbors of Pollock Krasner in the Springs. So, I think we could almost say, not quite, but we could almost say that it's not even just East Hampton, it's the Springs. That is the, if you wanted to pinpoint what is the most important area for these artists, we'd have to say their associations with one another in the Springs. We might even put in Louse Point, because that's where they went to the beach.
Is there a Jimmy Ernst?
No, there might be a Jimmy Ernst in the collection. Where's Jess? Yeah, I'm sure there is. Yes. Yeah, we could have put him in this. As a matter of fact, I found out about Elizabeth Parker, and I was aware of Elizabeth Parker as one of the artists who founded the Signa Gallery, and I was glad, and that was actually because of Jess that she reminded me that they were there.
Looking at the two,
What?
was that
Hoffman, yes, which I said in the yeah.
the two to Kooning say they're on paper, on
Yes.
canvas?
Yes.
And you said oil, but could you talk a little about the kinds of paints that were happening? It doesn't look like it's all oil. Are these all oil paintings? They were using latex, they were using all sorts of.
I don't know.
House paint.
Yeah, I think, certainly Pollock was using house paint. I don't know, because these are later. I don't know exactly. They could even have acrylic. They could even be partially acrylic anyway. They don't have to be oil necessarily. Yeah. And to me, de Kooning is the perfect example of someone that was an abstract expressionist his entire life. Because he always had this interest in both abstraction and figuration combined, and then he just continued it in his work. And the work changes somewhat over the years, but really we would identify all of it with abstract expressionism. Any questions? Yes, or comments?
I remember that Lee Krasner's sister and her nephew hung around in the Springs too. Can you say anything about this at all?
Lee Krasner's nephew, you mean Ronald Stein?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's a piece of his in the Pollock Krasner house. And I guess I don't really need to say this to a crowd of people that is in Guildhall, but you all know about the Pollock Krasner house and how it's a historic place and all of that. And inside the house is a work by Ronald Stein. And actually Ronald Stein went to Rutgers, where I taught years ago, long after him. But anyway, he was a student there.
And her sister too, I think. Lee's sister as well.
I don't know very much about it. Somebody want to comment on Lee's sister? I don't know her sister. I knew Lee, and I remember as an art student, because I was trained as an art student myself, I was dying to know what they did when they had these big canvases on the floor of Jackson Pollock. And you could see that some of them, not all of them, but some of them are turned under, and then the stripping is added. And I wanted to know if Lee helped him determine where to essentially cut the painting off and turn it around the edges. And she said yes, that she did help him with that, and which is what I figured would happen. I represent the estate of an artist who is married to another artist, and that's Dorothy Daner, who is married to David Smith. And Dorothy not only posed for him, but also helped him with his work. And she would, like he would call her to the studio and he'd say, should I put it here or here? And then she also helped with the titles of the work. So I had a feeling, given the fact that they were living out here in, working in their studios, that he would actually call her out to the studio and say, is this a painting? That was an interesting comment. Is this a painting?
Joan,
Yes.
I do know about Lee's sister.
Oh, there you are. How are you?
So Lee had two older sisters
Okay.
and a younger sister that was born in America after Lee was born.
Okay.
And one sister got married, had, I believe, 2 children, and died.
Oh.
So now the tradition in a Jewish family was the widow is going to marry the next sister. That would have been Lee.
Oh.
Lee said, no way am I doing that. Her little sister Ruthie had to marry the brother. And that's when they had Ronald Stein, the nephew from Springs.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm glad to see you. Who all those years was at the Pollock Krasner house when I was there too. And thank you to Joan Schwartz for coming out from New York. She is the partner of David Slifka and lent the wonderful work by David Slifka that we saw in the other room. And Joan, do you want to say anything about David? Huh?
David loved the area.
He loved the area, yes.
He loved to talk about it. He loved to talk about the artists who first came here. And he first came out in the late 40s as a visitor to both Pollock and to Kooning.
And Rick, maybe you'd like to tell us about your show at Cooperstown.
Yeah, I have a show from my collection. It's 19 women artists of the 50s and 60s called the Heroines of Abstract Expressionism. It's at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown. This is a show catalog that we have, and Joan wrote. And that's on the cover. Thank you, Joan, your contribution. And it's going to be up to the end of this year, December 31. It's a great show. 19 women artists, 35 pieces. I think it's the largest survey, the widest survey of ABEX women artists ever staged, I believe. 19 women artists. And thank you for your support. Thank you for your support. Thank you.
And there's a show at Katona also that Helen Harrison was going to see, just in the last few days, that is also devoted to women artists of abstract expressionism. So they're having an explosion of interest in their work.
Right.
Anybody else have any comments or?
I just
Yes.
want to make sure that when you say no preconceived notions
Yes.
as defining abstract expressionism, if an artist like Elaine Kooning comes in knowing she's making a figure
Yeah.
and even has a figure in mind,
Yeah.
and starts with that figure, and then her mind wanders all over and the expressionist part comes in, that preconceived notion of the figure doesn't take away from
Right.
calling it abstract expression.
Okay, that's a good point. This is actually, Bacchus is based on a sculpture by Jules Dalou that she saw in Paris. So, whether she had it in her mind or whether she actually made a sketch of it, I don't know, or she had a photograph of it, whatever. But that becomes the basis of the main figure. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is true of de Kooning. He's so interested in including women in his work and does them in various ways. And that's also true of Grace Hartigan in her work.
Right, thanks.
And this, by the way, speaking of which, the one there, that's based on the one of the caves, Glasgow Caves or Altamira, one of the I remember seeing a whole show of those at one time.
So Machiavelli was a neighbor.
He was a neighbor of the Pollocks, of Pollock and Lee, down the street. Nick Carone, yes. I think they have Nick Carone in his collection. Well, thank you all for listening.